So would you like to read a portion of the book that addresses some of these things we've been talking about?
The book is trying to, again, cover many things. I maybe if I pick one theme, and that is transition from culture to culture and what that does to your thinking and your what it did to my thinking and my understanding of the world may not do it for other people, and they may not even desire it. So this is from the very first story called A Woman on the Plain, which is about a woman leaving her home country without knowing that that's what she's doing. And the paragraph I want to read has to do with the way I understood travel before I actually found myself living in another culture permanently. So this is while I'm leaving my hometown to go to Bowling Green, Ohio, thinking that I will be there for 9 months and then I will come home. While wonderful and exciting, traveling abroad, the passage from my own time zone, language, and culture to another was always also somewhat unsettling. It felt as if a rug had been pulled from under my feet, hurling me into a void where I was off balance and out of control, and where things did not quite make perfect sense. Consequently, traveling was only enjoyable because it was temporary. Completing the cycle, returning to the starting points, regaining the balance, was an essential part of my traveling pleasure and, as far as I knew then, an inevitable one. I began mentally collecting observations and impressions, already preparing the stories I would tell upon my return to what I would soon begin calling my home country, then my old country, and finally stop referring to at all, perhaps relishing the moment of the homecoming and the storytelling even more than the experience itself, since the experience would only acquire its full meaning upon the completion of my journey, when, like a cat proudly dragging in a caught mouse, I lay it at my country's feet. So this is how I not only left my home country, but also, although I did not know it at the time, stepped out of the only cultural frame I had ever known, out of what Berger calls the Sacred Canopy, that had always made it possible for me to make sense of things, within which I had been me, which had so entirely been a part of my world that I had always taken it for the world itself. I only became aware of this, of the fact that what I used to take for reality had in fact been my worldview and not the actual world itself, some years later, as the 80s came to a close, when I was able to look back at it from the temporal and symbolic distance created by my long absence. It was only then that I clearly saw it, this old view of the world, old Sacred Canopy. It was sitting there like a slough, like an obsolete skin left behind by some growing, transforming animal.
That's so interesting, because I recently heard a scientist say that he had an epiphany in which he saw the entire globe. And people just laughed at him because he was supposed to be an earth scientist and analyzing geological formations, like you might analyze the physiognomy of a face, and people just laughed at him. But he said there was no way in the academic world to communicate that which he saw. He said it was a geography of the soul, and in an instant he saw it. So that kind of reminds me of that moment of reflection.
Yeah, obviously, there are certain things you can't see, just like I couldn't have seen this
right.
in a physical world, but it is an image that describes, I think, what it felt like. And in a way, you do see it. Again, it's not physical, you couldn't touch it.
Right.
But you see these, at least I see these outlines, that are of the old worldview and old culture.
So do you have a third section that shows something of the mind travel there, or the time travel?
I just have one more from this first section.
Yeah.
So when all this, and again, this is all very tied into my own life experience, so again, may not apply to other people. Mm-hmm. So at one point, I was in Bowling Green finding myself in the following situation. So the country I'm from fell apart. I don't belong to any of its parts, really. They want me to pick a narrow ethnic group here that was very popular here, that you say, I am, I don't know, a woman, I am this, identity. Then I looked through my studies, at my PhD studies, and through my reading, see, well, is there another label? Is there something that would fit me better? Mm-hmm. And this is that, this paragraph describes that, if I can find it. I did not think of myself as Yugoslavian or as Serbian or as anything really. For one, Yugoslavia of my youth did not exist anymore, not in its original form. Furthermore, somewhere along the way, I had realized that my culture of origin, the one that had provided the frame and the meaning to my life in Belgrade, might never have been simple or uniform in the first place, might never have been one in the sense in which I had thought it to be, undivided and uncontroversial, but actually consisted of a variety of particles, different ethnic and political groups, and variety of particles that different ethnic and political groups had deposited on the Balkan soil over thousands of years of history, all of them open to interpretation. Finally, I had no desire to claim any of the plethora of labels available to individuals in my situation: exile, refugee, expat, immigrant, guest worker. I felt I had outgrown all these individual, national, and cultural classifications, these simplifying one-dimensional categories. They could not contain someone like me.
So is that what you're seeking, the non-closure, the non-categorization of experience, so that experience becomes a category of its own because it simply refuses to exist? Is that what you're after? Because it's fascinating how you layer the words there.
I think for a moment I caught something in what you said. I'll try to recapture it, because I think in a way, not in the way you said it, but in the way I think you meant it. Mm-hmm. That is, I'm sorry. That it's not so much that I like the word experience. Mm-hmm. Before it has been categorized, before it has been labeled, mm-hmm. and then a new label comes, as it did, and you for a while you think, oh boy, this is okay, we finally found it, here we are, and then you see that's not it, and that's basically been my experience over and over and over again.
Do you call that an aha experience?
I guess you would call it aha if it happens in a moment. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't always, it happens over time. So or you start just looking differently at things, and they're the same things sitting there, but now you have a different way of seeing them. Yeah. So that's part of it. I myself, and I can read a little more, and that was where I saw myself going, which I think I was wrong to go to. Instead, I saw myself as a member of a new kind of nation, a trans nation, prefix trans here meaning beyond, over, across, not tied to a geographic location, but consisting of people like me. People from more than one place, between countries, in transition, unable or unwilling to attach themselves to any specific ethnic roots or national identity, or perhaps simply too confused to do so. People who had traveled too far in both space and time from their places of origin, so no signifier now referred clearly and unambiguously to what it used to signify: my people. So I thought, there would be this place where everybody is like me. And I did come across people whom I could talk to, who understood at least some of the ambiguity. And I came across them anywhere, but usually, of course, on the road, because that would be there. And really for a while it seemed like, well, that's where, of course, okay, I have no place in this like flat world there, but I do have a place here.
So is this a contemporary woman that's reinterpreting the role of the contemporary woman, or is it an ancient traveler who is interpreting the role of history in terms of non-category in space and time? where would you be in another time in history? Because what I'm thinking about when you're talking about this is now, sometimes they something like 3/4 of the world's globe, masses of people are being uprooted. Did you have a sense of that coming? Did you have a visionary sense of the prophetic, or of when you talk about the symbolic space and so on? Was there a sense that this would happen to so many people as it does today? Or was it an existential thought of the artist as traveler? That's what I keep coming back to, because, Mohanty talks about the artist as explorer, the artist as a tourist, the artist as, but she meant it more in the way of each person's story, no matter where they're from, comes out in a certain way of moving from one boundary to another.
I find that really interesting. I think that probably is the view I would more accept than there was nothing prophetic in my thinking, and certainly this is not the first time in history when people are uprooted. That is actually a common human experience.
But I think that it's good you're reminding us of that.
Yeah.
But what was interesting yesterday in our conversation is you talked about the choice you had. You said, well, you could have gone back. And I romanticized your decision or non-decision in the sense I said she could never go back. I never even, and I think that's what some Americans do, because of maybe pop culture or the mass consciousness of advertising. I thought, well, she made this decision. No, she couldn't go back. So could you address a little bit of that? And do you have that in some of your writing as well, where it addresses the non-decision of decision-making in a situation like that? I never knew that about you. Okay. Here we knew each other all these years. And I always said, she decided to do this because it was the only path she could take. And I think that goes back to the cause and effect of the biology and the biography of, if you do the right thing, this will happen. So could you address that?
I really, I could have gone back. There was and let me digress just a little bit.
Yes.
So when I first came here, one of the many misconceptions of people in Midwest, some of whom that I encountered there have never been to Indiana, let alone to another country.
Right.
So they simply, because they start from this premise that this is a free country. And from the other premise that that's a slave country where I'm coming from. So they just simply presume that it would have been really hard for me to leave Yugoslavia, but really easy to enter U.S. Now, anybody who's ever come to the U.S., for a foreigner, will know that's not true. Right. But they completely didn't believe me when I said it's not easy to enter U.S. I could leave Yugoslavia anytime. I could always travel back and forth. There was never any problem. Entering here was always a problem. In fact, I'm not going to read it, but I do have a section when I'm trying, them to get my passport stamped in Poland so I could come back here. That's sort of just a side on that same thing. But yes, it was my decisions to finally stay here. I did not have to do that. I could have gone back at any point. It would have been a different country. It would have been, a different passport. It would have been war maybe, but that wouldn't have been impossible in any way.
So is it the dilemma of the artist to make a decision that will have you have lessons, so to speak, or exposure to experiences that can then become your story and not someone else's? How do you deal with possessing the story? Because here you're showing how the art possesses the story, but how do you possess the story if you're not a photographer and you're trying to capture a moment and you're trying to capture it in writing? How do you possess your own story? Or is that again a post-colonial concept that doesn't belong in this conversation?
I'm not sure because I don't understand the question, but I figure, okay, at the simplest level, if it's my story, then it's my story. I don't need to do anything extra to possess it more than that.
Yes.
Now, as for the whole writing project, as for possessing the subject of the story.
Right.
I think that's a slightly different question. Mm-hmm. And that the project is, I think the project of writing generally is to capture something with words, to use words like grabbers and to get things. And of course, what you're capturing is something really nebulous. And so you have to have many different words around it so they can, but I don't, as for it being my story, I feel like it's my story. Now, this is from the last story in the book, which is called Mind Trouble. And it is written in a third person, although two of its central experiences are the ones that I had. There are other experiences that the main character has that were not mine. So I combined it into one narrative. The idea is basically that through certain practices, in this case meditation, you can access levels of consciousness that you didn't have before. And again, I don't mean anything mystical or magical.
Right. This is what's important.
I just mean that you suddenly see things. It's like a paradigm shift.
A kaleidoscope.
Because now you're given a different filter to look through, you will see new things. And so these pages describe that experience as, again, it happened to me, may not be true for everybody. Before coming to America, she had lived in the one and only cultural universe, the one she had been both figuratively and literally born into. Its treasure chest of wisdom and knowledge, fruits of thousands of years of efforts by the greatest human minds from all over the globe, had been served to her on the silver platter of education as absolute and universal truths. We already know this, she was told in effect, and this is true everywhere. You are fortunate to be starting out in life so well prepared. And she believed it. She had been trained to think critically about details, to look for fallacies and inconsistencies within texts, but never to question the so-called big picture. In fact, she did consider herself lucky to be living in such enlightened, learned times, and was truly grateful that she was landing in the United States, armed with so much useful information. She never doubted that in America she would find the same big picture, only rendered in local colors. It was these place-specific ways of doing things, the customs, the fashions, and the routines unique to this particular geographic location that she was curious about, and that she was prepared to learn in order to adjust to life in the new country. She did not expect this to take too long either, since all she needed to do was fill in details in an already pre-existing frame. And this is a story of shifting of the frame. Okay, right. That's what is sort of at that. And in fact, if I may read a little further, I think it will.
No, it's in the third person again.
Yeah.
And can you just address what does the third person do for the listener?
I actually don't know. What it did for me as a writer was to distance myself from the experience, to describe it as the experience that somebody else had.
Yes.
And then I could fill in the blanks a little more freely. Like maybe it didn't happen exactly like that, but that fits, that really gives me this better, it captures the idea better. It also makes me free to feel critical towards it.
Yes.
I'm actually never more critical than when I'm thinking about my own thinking, but I think this gives me some kind of distance so I can contemplate it. But that's about that.
But I think it's very important, this shift in person giving you a different consciousness about what you're writing.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a different perspective. It's like when I'm observing you, I have one set of experiences, and when I'm observing my inner world, another set of experiences. As it turned out, however, it took years. So what I thought would be like a few weeks to get adjusted to Midwest,
Right.
I was completely wrong on almost every account. So, and all the while, she inevitably lived on the cusp between cultures, between European and American symbolic orders. This vantage point made not only American culture visible to her, available for study, examination, and critique, but also caused her own native culture to emerge before her eyes, for the first time external to her. Like something conjured up on a stage by a magician, while she herself was seated in the audience, invited to watch, evaluate, and figure out its secrets. Observing these two cultures nestled next to each other, well, not simply observing it intellectually, but because she simultaneously interacted with people from both symbolic orders, living it, experiencing this duality day in and day out on her own skin, in her own heart, in her own brain, having double-edged messages repeatedly come at her, having them slap her and insult her and console her and cuddle her, having them embrace her one day and reject her the next, bathing in this cacophonous stew of often mutually exclusive opinions and objectives and needs and demands, engaging with them emotionally and intellectually and in every other possible way, and doing this for years. Well, that did something to her mind. It fine-tuned it, turned it into another kind of instrument, more sensitive and open in every direction, receptive and responsive to the minutest and the most diverse of stimuli, while stripping it of many of its preconceived notions.
That's such a beautiful passage. And what interested me was the symbolic order you talk about. Can you tell me a little bit what that's talking about?
What I mean by it. And people use it in different ways, and it may not be exactly the way I use it. What I mean, I want to put symbolic order instead of, say, dominant ideology.
Right.
Or dominant culture, or any of those a little more fraught terms. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I say symbolic order. What it is basically is all the cultural, in Marxist terms, superstructure that we have over.
Is it archetypal? Or not only?
Archetypal would, I think, imply that it comes from a more general, more universal place, and it's only applied to local circumstances. So I don't mean that. I mean that we develop, in popular culture terms, these are beliefs of the culture in which you live. Rituals, it's icons, it's common narratives that organize our lives. That's what I mean.
So I think
worldview.
Yes, I think also one question leading off of that, is there a special ritual, because we were talking about that yesterday, or a special belief system other than meditation that can plunge you into the open-mindedness of articulating first person, second person, third person, and getting that multiple point of view so clearly as you did there? Is there something besides meditation? Because people say if you meditate long enough, you will see every chakra and so on and have these epiphanies. But is there anything that you could say, to other writers or students that say, oh, I just want to be a writer? We have so many meetings with people and they go, oh, you're an author. Mm-hmm. And that means something symbolically, which I've never quite been able to grasp. So I wonder just what you thought about that. So I'm going from the symbolic order to what is the symbol of being this person, a being who can have this kind of experience in the first place.
I think anybody can. You would need to just be willing to. I think in my case, at least, I think I'm especially susceptible to my mind being closed. I find things and, I think, okay, I'm there, I've arrived. So I have to be really careful to keep it open and to understand that wherever I'm now may not be where, I want to be. Mm-hmm. I think the fastest shortcut, in my opinion, would be trying to see things from a perspective of another.
Is it having compassion for the boundary of the self and the boundary of the other? Is it othering and self-reflexivity? But some people say this compassion for the self is limited, because if you're not in the other man's moccasins, so to speak, or the other woman's moccasins, you just haven't a clue.
And there is a degree to which I agree with that. It's very tricky. I don't know. I know I've talked to people who tell me they've studied my culture and they understand it really well. And I know, I can see they don't.
Yeah.
Because I think it's also some of this, and I don't know if I managed to capture that anywhere, but there is this experience of this in the body.
Right.
That you have to have had, and not once, not as an experiment, not because you were trying to be open-minded, but you had to have been exactly in that position.
At that time.
At that time, and if you were not that person at that time, you couldn't have been that. Yes, you can learn about it, you can try to experience it. So I don't really know. I mean, I don't have an answer to that question. Is it the only person? Can you only write about your own experiences? Well, that's clearly not true because people write about everything.
Right.
Now, whether that's then quote unquote authentic or successful, I don't know. I'm trying again in my new book to completely put myself in somebody else's shoes, where arguably I have no right being in those shoes because it's not my world.
But that's debatable.